Tilburg University and Mind Labs present TAISIG Talks, the podcast that keeps you updated on the latest developments in the field of artificial intelligence in just 1 hour.
Hello, this is the 23rd edition of the TAISIG Talks. TAISIG is the Tilburg Artificial Intelligence Special Interest Group. My name is Pieter Spronck. I'm a professor of computer science at Tilburg University. And I'm here today with Noortje Venhuizen and Brouwer, who are specialists in the neurocomputation of language, which is a topic that I personally know very little about. So I am curious to hear what they are actually doing and why it is of importance, and of course, what the link to artificial intelligence is. So, hi, Harm and Noortje. Can I ask you to introduce yourself quickly?
Hi, my name is Noortje Venhuizen, and I am an assistant professor here at the Department of Cognitive Science and Artificial Intelligence at Tilburg University.
So my name is Harm Brouwer. I'm an associate professor here at Tilburg University, also in the Department of Cognitive Science and Artificial Intelligence, and I am the principal investigator of the Neurocomputation of Language Lab.
Okay, thank you. So, neurocomputation of language is a mouthful, and there is on the Tilburg University website, there is actually a page on this where you explain a lot about what you're doing. I tried reading that page. I understood many of the words, but the combination of the words was sometimes a bit hard. And perhaps you can tell us in layman's language what it actually is that you're doing.
So neurocomputation of language. Actually, I think the question that we seek to answer is a very simple one. It's namely how, when, and where in the human brain is sort of meaning attributed to language that we read or language that we hear. Turns out that this is actually a very difficult question to answer. So I just heard you say in your own question, like the combination of words, they don't make sense to me. And this is sort of at the core of this question as well. So we perceive language 2 or 3 words a second. Either we read language or we hear language when we speak. So what are the processes involved in there? So how do we identify the identity of words? So how do we know which word is which? How do we activate the meaning of words? What are the factors that influence this meaning activation? And in the end, how do we combine the meaning of incoming words with the words that we've already perceived before to sort of construct a larger interpretation? And so that's neurocomputation of language in a nutshell.
Yeah. So that's mostly, I think, the neuro part, yes. Right? So that is the asking the question, how is language processed in the brain? But in order to arrive at this question, we use methods from computational methods from AI as a general field, right? In order to be able to get at an answer of how does the brain process language, and how can we model that? How can we simulate that processing using the computational tools that we have at our availability, right? So, and we are mostly interested in both what are the representations that underlie language. So, how can we capture all of this complex aspect of meaning that we know language has? How can we capture that in a sort of mathematical or computational manner? And how can we identify the computational processes and simulate the computational processes that the brain also does in order to arrive at a complex meaning in the sense that humans also understand language.
Okay. Well, I have to say that I asked layman's language, and it still is not completely clear to me. And I started to stumble when you used the word meaning.
Yes.
You can understand why.
Yes. I think we stumble when we use the word meaning, because I think this is one of the main questions. So I think this is you're the semanticist, so maybe I actually forward this question to you for now, and then I'll give my neuroscience perspective later.
Yeah. So I when we talk about the meaning of a word, for instance, right? We may think directly of looking in a dictionary and thinking like, okay, when I want to know the meaning of a cat, I'll just look into the dictionary and I get a description of what is a typical cat. One question that we ask ourselves is that the way that if I hear the word cat, is that the way in which I understand that word, right? Is that related to the dictionary meaning, or is that maybe more related to my experiences with actually encountering a cat? And also my experiences in the sort of the larger situations in which I have experience with cat, right? I know that I can pet it, and I have memories of my own cat that live back home. So all of these things contribute to what we call sort of the meaning of our understanding when we hear a word, and it becomes, I think, even more complex when we start to think of combinations of words, so sentences or larger utterances, where we are not only interested in saying, okay, we have to identify what the meaning of a single word is, but when I say something like, Harm and I went to the restaurant yesterday, right? So there are some words in that sentence that you can know the meaning of, and or you can look it up in a dictionary.
I know what a restaurant is.
Yes, exactly.
I know what yesterday is, etc.
Exactly. But arguably, and what is at the core of our work is that when I say something like that to you, you also make and we call these indirect inferences. You also make pragmatic inferences about saying like, okay, well, probably, you had some wine. If you know Harm and I, then probably there was wine involved. There was some dim lighting. So you basically construct a whole situation model, right? Of that meaning, and that is the thing that we want to be able to capture in our work, which is, and then we have to be very, very selective, right? Because we want to be able to construct these meanings in a computational mathematical manner. So we want to actually be able to calculate from a sequence of words what that meaning is, but also we want the meaning to be as sort of associative and rich as possible. So we have to basically balance these sources in our work.
And before we go to the neurocomputation version of that, what you say here, okay, there's a sentence. You say to me, we went to the restaurant yesterday. This evokes a picture in my mind, or at least I start filling in blanks. And probably if you say more, some of these blanks will be removed and will be replaced by more details. But that is happening for me. Somebody else might get a different interpretation of such a sentence.
Yes.
So how can you compute something like that? Because there is no single outcome.
No. So I guess the way, so that's I guess sort of complicating the story even further and talking about interactions between people and how can we actually align and define what we call a common ground between what we are talking about. So for now we are focusing on the larger question, like if we can define a sort of general representation that captures the meaning of all of the interlocutors, and sort of leaving apart all of the personal associations that you have, but abstracting away from that and trying to focus on, okay, what is the core and sort of the typical situation model that is being constructed. But critically, we also allow our models to have what we call those probabilistic inferences, in the sense that the situation models are not necessarily capturing just things that are true and false or that you know for certain, right? You make sort of probabilistic inferences that you assign a probability of a likelihood that we are drinking wine at dinner, for instance.
Yeah.
So, and those the weight of those probabilities, of course, leaves much room for having the individual differences between different people that communicate.
Okay. Yeah, I have a lot of questions about those models, but we'll get to that. So you wanted to add something more of the human brain to this, I assume?
Yeah, I think So lots of work has been done in formal semantics. So basically taking mathematical approaches to the questions that Noortje just posed. And you often then end up with semantic frameworks or frameworks for representing and computing meaning that are effectively rule-based systems, like in the traditional AI kind of idea. One complication that we have in the neurocomputation of language side, or the neurobiology of language side, is that we actually want to take those frameworks or those representations and express them in neural hardware. And in the sort of the most basic sense, we don't want words, or we don't want boxes that certain frameworks have, but we want sort of activity patterns of brain cells or numbers effectively. So we get the problem that we want to sort of express everything that Noortje was just talking about, but then effectively taking all that mathematical machinery and expressing it in a type of hardware that's reminiscent of the way the brain computes things, and that's sort of complicating factor, I think. And and we have been doing quite a lot of work in that direction, I would say, in trying to develop such a framework, which we call distributional formal semantics. So a lot of non-layman terms here, but that try to combine, basically that try to incorporate these mathematical approaches onto the level of representation that we can actually represent in neural hardware. So,
but when you say neural hardware, what do you mean?
In the simplest sense, effectively as a vector of numbers. So as a collection of numbers that we can represent in.
But numbers are not hardware.
Numbers are not hardware. The mimic. So the analogy here is basically how artificial neural networks are a very loosely based on like biological hardware, in the sense that what those collection of numbers represents is the activity pattern of brain cells. And so we want to express meaning in these collections of activity patterns of brain cells. So that's the goal, and it's a further complicating
yeah, you can say that again.
Yeah.
I mean, I started to understand what you were saying, Noortje, about models, but an artificial neural network is a model.
Yes.
So, and you say you're doing different things, or at least you take different approaches to the whole problem. So, where's the difference then?
I wouldn't say I wouldn't say we take different approaches. I think we actually sort of try to marry the background of Noortje's basically Noortje's background, right? So formal semantics with this idea of incorporating this into our neural models. And maybe I can say a little bit more about our neural models to make that slightly more clear. So what we try to do is explain what I said earlier, how, when, and where in the human brain basically meaning is attributed as linguistic input comes in. And what we can do in humans is we can study them behaviorally, and we can study them neurally. So in the focusing on the neural sense for now, what we can do is measure their brain activity, for instance, using electrodes placed on the scalp. And what we get is a very fine-grained signal over time that tells us when certain computations take place. And what we try to do with our neurocomputational modeling, or in the neurocomputation of language, is actually build computational models that mimic this behavior. So those computational models are, in our sense, artificial neural network models that process language on a word-by-word basis, that construct a representation of utterance meaning, not with the goal to beat, say, ChatGPT, but with the goal to actually mimic human behavior, with basically all the successes of human language comprehension, but also all the failures, because this helps us explain how humans accomplish this task.
Okay. So things start to get a bit more clear. So if I understand it correctly, you build models
Yes.
As artificial neural networks. Now, if somebody who listens to this doesn't know what an artificial neural network is, that's the basis for much of the modern AI.
Yes.
And you can leave it at that. It's just, let's say, a big computation with lots and lots and lots and millions and millions of numbers in there.
Yes.
And then something goes in and something comes out. So what goes in is text, sentence, language. And what comes out is meaning.
Yes.
Yes.
So those are the representations that I was talking about, right? So what comes out is, in the sense that Harm was telling, a activation pattern that we take to be sort of reflective of an activation pattern across neurons. And that activation pattern, we can actually interpret that, and it represents the meaning of that collection of words that we fed into the model, and it represents that meaning as basically a point within a very large meaning space. So the way if we are talking about an activation pattern, so a list of numbers, a vector that Harm is calling it, that is actually in the same way that we can identify for a sequence of numbers, we can identify a point in just a 3D space, for instance, for 3 numbers, right? The way that the way that we capture meaning in our representations is that the goal of the system, right? The goal of the models is to construct an utterance level meaning, which constitutes a point in the meaning space in such a way that we can also identify sort of what meanings within that meaning space are more or less related to the meaning that is being constructed. So to get back to my example of going to the restaurant, when I process a sentence, like Harm and I went to the restaurant, I arrive at a point in my sort of my meaning space with all sort of different associations that are closer and further away, and I can make particular inferences. So I have some point in the meaning space that is close by, that I probably ordered food, right? So that is a very likely interpretation, a very likely inference that is being made from that point in meaning space, despite the fact that this was not literally part of the sentence that was processed.
It's maybe good to add that these models are, even though they are what you just said, these artificial neural network models that underlie much of today's machine learning and AI approaches, they're not large language models in that sense, trained to do next word prediction on large corpora. So they use these representations that we've developed. I always call them toy models, so they can understand sentences in a limited, confined world, and their core goal, the core reason for existence, basically, is to help us understand, for instance, these brain measurements in human participants. So it's really about explaining how humans do it, and not about achieving ChatGPT levels of.
Yeah, because so you mentioned ChatGPT now, and you mentioned it earlier. So GPTs, as far as I understand them, do something like this. So you have a word, and that word could have different kind of meanings. Like I take the word pipe, which could be something that you smoke, but could also be a pipe in the ground, a sewer pipe. But that is close to other words, and by examining the sentence, you place it somewhere in the meaning space. So if the sentence seems to indicate that there's tobacco there, then it gets into the meaning space of the pipe that you smoke. So smoke is there in the neighborhood as well, but not water. So for a restaurant in general, eating would be in the neighborhood. So that's what GPTs do. So because you say what we do is more what humans do rather than what GPT does. And so what do you mean? Where is the difference?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and that's, I think, still an open question. So So first of all, let me just add one thing. The reason for doing it in our toy models where we have full control is that we actually know that when we observe, say if the model mimics human behavior in terms of, say, these brain measurements, we can arrive at causal explanations of why the model actually does that. So this is why we want this strict control. And like Noortje was explaining, the representations that we construct are fully introspective. So we know exactly where in this space things are and why they are there. Now, ChatGPT is often, and GPTs and these larger neural networks are often described as being basically black box architectures. That still doesn't do away with the question of posing how similar they are to human language processing systems. And there are people that make these claims pretty hard, that say, look, okay, we studied the internal representations of these models. We look at humans, and there seems to be a strong correlation there. So ChatGPT goes in that direction. We've been looking at that again from the brain correlate perspective, and we said, okay, if it indeed behaves like human beings, then we should also be able to sort of derive estimates from its online processing behavior, so word-by-word processing behavior, mimicking these effects that we see in human beings. And there,
just to make sure that I understand what you're doing. So you do brain measurements. So you put electrodes on someone's head. Yeah. You say something to a person. You see something spiking, and so you see you get a big graph with lots of peaks in it, and you want to see the same kind of behavior. Probably not exactly the same peaks, but you want to see the same things happening in neural network, an artificial neural network.
Yeah. So the goal there is that what we take. So when we take these brain measurements, we often see systematic fluctuations in those brain measurements, so systematic voltage fluctuations over time, and we take those fluctuations. We call those components of the neural signal, and we take those components to actually index specific computational operations carried out specific computations carried out in the brain. And just to give you an example, so the classic study from the 80s, he spread his warm bread with socks versus he spread his warm bread with butter. You may have heard that sentence before somewhere.
No, I didn't. But
okay, I speak about it all the time.
Probably you find it weird.
So what SOX does is produce this negative deflection in the signal that's very robust, and it's been replicated thousands of times. And this is not just a reflection of the anomaly that it's odd to spread your warm bread with socks, but we know actually that it sort of goes down the way the more expected the word is. So we can have a sentence like George got fired at work, but he couldn't tell his wife, family, and fog, for instance, where fog is completely anomalous and family gives you this intermediate response. And we know that we can, for instance, if we talk about socks a lot, like he said, I couldn't find fresh socks when I went to this interview this morning. So I looked in the washing machine and I found a pair of fresh socks. And then I said, and then I spread my warm bread with socks. That this effect goes away completely. So what these measurements are telling us, or what we have been theorizing, is that what this negative deflection is an index of is that accessing meaning in long-term memory. So what this seems to suggest is that what happens in the human brain after word identification, or as part of word identification, is almost like almost dump system that makes available relevant information in long-term memory that we can then work with. So if we then transpose this to the ChatGPT story, if it is a model of human language processing, it should effectively also mimic this memory stage. If it doesn't, it can still do a very good job at all these linguistic tasks, but it may not be mimicking the way the human brain solved this problem.
Yeah. It's like with chess.
Yeah,
that chess computers don't play chess like a human plays chess, but they're really good at playing chess. But they do it in a different way.
Yeah, and then the question is indeed what you're interested in. What we're interested in is how humans play chess, or how humans process language in this sense.
Yeah, the odd thing is that sort of this success of ChatGPT really has, I don't know, I think me personally, but also in the field, sort of entered a shock wave in a way, right? Because it was always quite easy when we were presenting our work at conferences. It was always quite easy to say yes. Back then they were still just called language models. These language models can capture a lot of information of meaning, and the way that these language models actually do that is by looking at a lot of text, right? Processing large amounts of text. So that's why they are currently called large language models. And they identify the meaning of a word. So they identify the meaning of a table, for instance, by saying, okay, a table occurs very often in the context of a chair and in a context of dining, for instance. So probably a table has to do something with that. And that is purely based on the linguistic signal. The way that these models are trained is based on language co-occurrences. And so what I was telling, until like 3 years ago, it was quite easy when we got to conference to say, yes, that works very well, and we can get quite a good grasp of what is the lexical meaning, so the word meaning of a word like table from these kind of co-occurrences. But when we get to the level of understanding an entire sentence, then it becomes way more difficult to capture that using just these sort of textual co-occurrences. Arguably for the restaurant, sort of I went to the restaurant example, you need a lot of world knowledge, right? Not just information from text and how words co-occur with each other, but you need knowledge about the world, that you go typically to a restaurant in the evening, that it's then dark, that there is a particular kind of lighting. So these are all things that contribute to what I called the situation model, or the sort of the meaning that you construct. And the interesting thing is that now with these generative AI models, well, as Harm said, it's still a black box, and we still don't really know how they are exactly trained and what the representations are that they build up. But they do give you a feeling that they do get this higher level understanding. Yeah. So it becomes more difficult to make the argument that just from linguistic co-occurrences we cannot get to these sort of higher level meaning of entire utterances and discourses, because you do get the behavior from the GPT models. I don't know. I still think that there's a lot of things lacking, and there have also been critiques of large language models that argue that they start to hallucinate, right? That they make very strong statements that are untrue, or that they are inconsistent in their answering, because when I talk to you and you tell me something about, I don't know, the color of your socks, then you will keep that the same during our conversation, hopefully. Whereas in the large language models, that's not necessarily the case. So they are not sort of that trustworthy in that sense. But yeah, it has opened up a very interesting debate in the field, and what I found very interesting is that even people that have been working on sort of natural language understanding for their entire careers, or are very deep into the methodology, were also just blown away and sort of shocked by how well these models performed. And that is actually a bit disturbing, right? If you think of it, like people that know sort of the tools and that know the theory that they are working on, that they still feel that there is some sort of magic going on. And maybe your example of chess is actually a very good one, because I can also imagine that there has also been a very, very long history of trying to get to the point, right, where chess computers outplay human players, and at some point it just switched.
So just to add, I like that example a lot, actually, because I think so your first question, what's the neurocomputation of language about? And it's exactly that difference that you just said, right? So it's ChatGPT might get to a level of language understanding, quote, quote, that is very impressive. But to the neurocomputation of language, or to my work, the core question still is like, but does that transfer to what humans do? And if so, what parts, or doesn't it? Because what I'm interested in is that part, right? So how does the human brain play chess?
Yeah. So that is, I think that is where part of at least the importance of this research lies, because I understand. I was also quite impressed with things that something like ChatGPT could do. That was the first time that I was actually communicating with such a it's more than a large language model. It's a GPT, but it did really well in simplistic conversations. But it was very easy to let it make mistakes. It was really with one question, with one statement, I could show, look, it does not understand what it's actually, what I'm actually saying here. And another thing is that, okay, I start talking about a particular topic, and then I switch to a different topic, but that old topic was still there, and it was not switching from that topic. So it started interpreting my next statements in the framework of the earlier topic that I was discussing. Even
Which is already...
when I wrote, look, I meant a different topic. No, we stick there. I did too much there, and and that means that there is no understanding. But
are you as impressed with ChatGPT as you were with your child when she was 5? In terms of natural language understanding?
Well, my child at 5 was still learning, and ChatGPT I see making more and more mistakes. But
child at 6, child at 7.
Well, maybe actually that is the thing. Yeah. When children make mistakes, they start fixing them. And these GPTs don't fix their mistakes. The programmers fix the mistakes when they get noticed, and then often the fixes are. So I've been a programmer for a while, and then you know that when you start fixing stuff, you're making more chaos, and you see that actually happening with these GPTs as well. There's a mistake coming, and they fix it manually, and then a bigger mistake starts occurring, like what we had recently with the generative image generation, where we want to fix that. All CEOs are white men in their 50s smoking cigars, and suddenly it led to black Nazi officers because they were trying to fix this. Yeah. So, because there's no understanding there, and the language models is probably the same thing. So that's what was my interpretation of the importance of what you're doing. But maybe you want to say more about that, because that was actually my second question. We're only down to my second question: is why is this important, what you're doing?
That's always the difficult question. So why is it important what we're doing? So I think the questions that we seek to answer are very fundamental questions. So we're basically trying to explain something about human nature. So something about why we are how we are, and why we may be different from other animals. And I think there's lots of implications there. In if we have a better understanding of how we grasp language, I think the easy answers here are that we could help when people have language deficits, language disorders. I think arguably, and probably other neuroscientists are going to disagree with me, producing a sentence, so taking some concept, so some complex idea. I mean, we've been discussing quite complex material already, and taking that idea that involves retrieving complicated concepts, putting them in complicated order to each other, and conveying that in a sentence, 2-3 words a second, is a remarkable feat that humans have achieved. And so in that sense, it's the fundamental question of trying to get at that. I also think that there's lots of other things to learn from that. So I guess now with ChatGPT, it's slightly different. But when I used to promote my courses on neurocognition of language, we were previously working in a computational linguistics department, I would always say, like, yeah, you can study natural language understanding under Dr. X and Y, but if you were at the conference and the competition achieved an F score that was way higher than yours, wouldn't you like to have a look in the kitchen, right? And I think if you look at children and their level of language proficiency and understanding and their speed of acquisition, there's something to learn from that as well, also in solving more practical and applied AI systems. So in essence, very fundamental, and maybe I also sort of consider myself just a very fundamental scientist in that respect. But I do think there's lots of direct and indirect implications from that kind of work. So understanding language processing in the brain may also aid us in understanding other aspects of human cognition, and also maybe some of the big questions like consciousness, etc.
Yeah, and I think the rise of these GPT models and the success and the way that people have started to use them also shows how language processing is so at the core of what we do as humans, and that we can also, if we develop machines or computers that process language in a correct way, and I think looking at the human perspective is very important in that respect. It's exactly also because of the examples that you give about the how unreliable the current large language models are. I think it is very important to think of, and it's very useful to think of, okay, if we can identify the way that we process language, also the way that we communicate to each other, we can be of great benefit for AI applications in a very general sense, just because language is so at the core of sort of our society.
Yeah, so I see in the AI developments, because I know about AI more than about neurocomputation, but you want to achieve something. You want to achieve a human level reasoning, intelligence, and human level is lots of different aspects. So you have to be able to formulate, but that understanding part is there. And that's one of the dangers, I think, of these large language models that we have nowadays, is that they work so well, but they're definitely not perfect. And the question is, can they get better than they are? Are they not basically doing some... So that was a comparison with chess again. So when chess in the 1956, chess was defined as one of the goals for artificial intelligence. We have to get a good chess player because that needs human understanding and needs human tactical insights, etc. And then we got a great chess player in 1997, but it played chess in a very different way. So many people said, okay, that problem is solved, but actually the problem that you were working on was not solved.
Yeah.
Yep. You solved the particular example.
Yeah.
Yes, agreed.
Yeah, I think that transfers to what is currently being done in natural language processing with these large language models, and so because they work so good, also a lot of researchers sort of get seduced by going in the direction of saying like, yeah, but maybe we can actually derive estimates like your harm's brain potentials from these large language models, and just see how well they do.
Well, that would be great if that could be done. Yes. Because then that means that the large language models work in the same way as a human.
Yeah, we did that work. It doesn't work.
No, I can imagine.
And even if you can go very far, and then you have a very nice correlation between how the brain responds and how the language model responds, I don't think that necessarily says that it's doing the same thing, right? And therefore, I think it is very important to also to not forget the theorizing that we have been doing for many decades on what is sort of this meaning, this understanding that humans use, and how do they use this understanding indeed to come to decisions and to make choices. Really, the cognitive science perspective, right? So we are not only the AI department, but also the cognitive science department, and I think that perspective is very, very important in these kind of questions to take. Like, what are sort of the core theory, and how can we, with that theory in mind, understand the extent to which particular applications do or do not reflect human behavior or human processing.
Okay. Well, actually, we discussed many of the questions that I had already. One that is still open, because we had a little talk before this time, and you said you mentioned reading thoughts of people. Maybe you would like to say something about that.
Yeah, somehow I've turned out into the Dr. Mind reading since I moved to Tilburg. So I guess this sort of addresses two points actually, because also what's the role of AI in this whole neurocomputation of language endeavor? So there has been interest recently in saying, okay, we've got this brain activity that we can measure, and we've got various ways of doing that. So we can use, say, a method called EEG, which measures electrical activity from the scalp. But we also have methods where we place people in a scanner and we can actually get slightly slower signal, but we know where things are going on.
It's the blood-based.
The blood-based, so fMRI. And people have used AI methods to construct what they call decoders, to basically say, okay, we can train up a model having, let's say, people measurements of people listening to podcasts for 16 hours, I believe, in an fMRI scanner. And then we try to build a decoder that sort of takes a new slice or a series of slices of brain activity and tries to reconstruct what those people were reading at that point. This might, like ChatGPT, might have seemed very futuristic 6-7 years ago. This actually works reasonably well nowadays. Current method.
Okay, but that is, just to be clear, that would be would that be mapping brain signals to part of a podcast, or would it be mapping brain signals to the topic of the podcast?
It would be mapping brain signals to actual text. So reading out actual sentences from people's neural activity.
Okay.
So this
and
paper
you say that can be done.
This paper was published in Nature Neuroscience. It's not perfect, but it's definitely impressive. There's a Studium Generale talk on this that you can watch on YouTube, actually. So this works reasonably well, actually, and it works so well that they even get it to work with people watching videos without audio, and you can read out a description of what is in the video. So the system produces text that describes from the brain recordings what the video is about. It works with imagined language. It's not perfect, but it's definitely a massive step forward from being able to decode 1 or 2 words, which was the current state of the art. It's still clever engineering. So what they do is basically use a massively generative approach. So they continuously use ChatGPT to try and predict what might come next, give a whole list of candidates, and then compare predicted brain activity to actual brain activity. But I do think there's actually lots of interesting directions from that general approach for also the neurocomputation of language, in that I think using these AI-based methods, which we call AI, but just boil down to straight up linear regression that we all had in high school.
Some people call that AI.
Some people call that AI, yes. But also to investigate those questions that we were talking about. So, okay, how does the brain represent meaning? And can we sort of contrast different meaning representations and see how well we can decode them? Because we can learn something if a particular type of meaning representation that encodes particular types of inferences, for instance, works way better than a more shallow one, for instance, then that's may tell us something about how basically the nature of those representations in the brain. Again, also here, I think this is currently limited to lexical meaning, so decoding concepts like cat and dog. And an open question is, again, how can we go to more like this combination of words that you started out with? I thought it was a great start of this podcast, actually. And I think this is mainly limited by the fact that we just don't know how to do that, unless we use these toy kind of setups. But also about localization. So they this particular paper that I talked about, which was published in Nature Neuroscience, also looked at, okay, so we've got this decoding working now. Can we actually see if different regions of the brain give us better decoding performance?
Yeah.
That's rather inconclusive, but these would be the ways to go forward. So I think that's also for our field very interesting approach.
Yeah, because it is still there is still a lot of unknowns about where in the brain particular operations take place. So we do get the feeling that there has been there has of course been a very long history already in research, but there are still a lot of things that are very much unknown about exactly, firstly, what operations take place and where in the brain do they take place, and that of course also has a very direct medical application. Like if you know, if a particular brain area is severed, if we know what sort of the computations are that are typically covered by that brain area, then we can also maybe find a way to.
The criticism that like large language models are black boxes also applies to the brain. It's a massive black box, and we know very little. I actually start my neurocognition. I used to start my neurocognition of language seminar back in our old institute by saying that if you come here to learn about how the brain processes language, then this is not going to happen because we're not going to know in the next 50 years, but we can make little steps one at a time.
Yeah, and the nice thing is with these new advances of these AI methods, right? Yes. That could bring us further. And these and the interesting thing is actually that you don't take something like a GPT model as a analogy to how humans process language, but you take it as a tool and say, okay, we know that we have a model that does pretty well in predicting for sequences of words what the next word is. So we can use that information to also make additional predictions about brain activity and compare those predictions to the actual observed brain activity, and thereby learn or make a guess about what a person is thinking at a particular moment. So I think I really like that perspective of not directly saying, okay, now we have solved natural language processing, but we can actually use those tools from AI also to talk about more fundamental questions.
Yeah, maybe so. One addition there is that this really has moved the field forward significantly in the last couple of years. So if you think about how we would traditionally approach these electrical recordings, we get say a voltage measurement every millisecond at multiple locations over the scalp. What we would normally do is say, okay, let's take the average in 300 to 500 milliseconds and do a comparison between means, right? In two conditions. Say yeast bread is warm bread with socks versus butter, and say, there's a statistical significant difference there. Obviously, this is conflating 200 milliseconds of
information,
fine-grained spatial temporal data into one comparison of means. And so I think like AI methods, both decoding methods that basically take the entire electrode grid and so the entire majority of information, right, or everything that is available over time to sort of predict whether this was a SOX or butter condition, but also doing it the other way around and say, hey, if we know that so without taking into account which condition something is from, but if we know that this word was unexpected, can we actually reproduce the brain signal from those properties of the words? And that works pretty well, and that's what we've been using in our experimental analysis in the last, I think, 5 papers or something. So, and I think that's super exciting because I really think that just gives us so much more power to look at that high-dimensional, multidimensional signal that we can extract from the brain.
So do we have to be scared that AI is going to read our minds?
I already answered this question, I think, in my my answer then was, can AI read your mind? And I said no, but also not yet.
But there's actually maybe there's a difference. Maybe there's no difference. But if you're just thinking about something or you're saying something, doesn't that give very different signals?
That's a very good question. So the majority of research is actually on comprehension using basically neural methods. The core reason for this is that if we do these electrical measurements, we actually don't want participants to move because we don't want them doing anything else because we get muscular activity, etc. So it's really difficult to do. It's not that's not being done, but it's just understudied, I would say. And the question is whether there's a separate network for production versus comprehension, or whether these share circuits, etc.
Yeah.
So these are open questions.
But also the reading of thoughts. So can an AI read our thoughts? That was the question that you asked. And then I'm wondering, okay, I can imagine that when I'm talking about something, that an AI can predict what the next sentence that I'm going to say.
Yeah,
but when I'm thinking about a topic, can the AI, is that the same?
Well, these nature neuroscience results were without focalizing it, right? So that's really from basically just brain activity. Then the question is what happens when people think about those things internally, but that's still an open question. And I think
but probably they ensured, and I haven't read that paper, but they ensured that people would be thinking about the right thing or the thing that they wanted by giving them.
Yeah, so that was so they they listen to a podcast, and that is actually what the thing that is being then reproduced, of course. So I think what you're asking is a very large question, like how linguistic are our thoughts, right?
I guess that's maybe the question you're asking.
How close are like how close is sort of what we capture with language? How close is that to our thoughts? And that is a very philosophical question.
I think it's a very practical question.
Well, yeah, in a way as well. And I think practically we can come very close with language in capturing what we are thinking. So in practical terms, I think those just sort of phrasing the thoughts in terms of language is actually very feasible. Exactly because language is not just like the meaning of I don't know. Table is not just the thing that is a table, but it is everything that comes with it. So that is why I would argue that language is actually so rich that it can capture also the richness of thought.
Yeah, I was just going to add that, like, I think the two main results that really convinced me is that, like, the imagined language, right? So basically, they had to imagine the podcast again in the scanner, and they could sort of accurately decode that. And the second is the videos. So watching a video and basically without auditory input, and that it could sort of accurately get at a description of what was going on in the video. There's also just a couple of, so it still requires active cooperation. So if you start doing like a, count to sevens in your head while you're watching this video, for instance, it doesn't work that well anymore. Plus that a model trained on you is not going to work on me or on Noortje and the other way around. And I think these are the main setbacks. But given how fast ChatGPT came and even took like top NLU people of natural language understanding people by surprise, I'm very reluctant to say that, to foreshadow how it's going to look in 5 years.
Well, one other thing to add is that what I think is very interesting on of these kind of successes is also the idea that language is not so special in itself, right? So when we listen to a podcast or we watch a video, in all of those cases, or even if we are doing mathematical sums, in all of those cases we are constructing some representation of meaning, and I think that is very much at the core of our work. That in the traditional approach to language, like the way that language is structured and the way that particular words fit together or do not fit together. So the syntax of language has had a very prominent role in the research of language as a sort of organism, but also language within the brain. And I think what we are now moving towards, also with the use of these AI methods, is a more general approach to cognition, in which language is not something that has a sort of special property of that we have these different components, which are the words that together have a meaning, but that language becomes something that is part of just a larger idea of that humans, but also animals, right, attribute meaning to the things that they perceive. And in this respect, we have actually also started collaborating with a colleague here from our department who is working on music cognition, where we try to make analogies between how music is perceived and understood and sort of meaning attributed to music in a parallel to how that is done with language.
Yes.
So, and I think, yeah, that is a very important corollary also of these sort of mind reading results.
Okay, thank you. What are you currently working on?
The same old question: how, when, and where in the brain is meaning attributed to linguistic input?
Yeah, but is there something specific that you try to do at the moment?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think we were both actively now working on getting a better grasp of processing reference. So basically, words that refer back to material that has been mentioned before, like a pronoun. So if we say something like, John went to the supermarket, he bought an apple, versus John and Mark went to the supermarket, he bought an apple, where it's unclear what is going on. But on in the larger scheme of things, I am moving more and more towards these encoding and decoding techniques.
Yes.
And trying to use AI to answer these kind of questions, like, okay, given that we've now got this vast majority of neural data or neuroimaging data, and we can explore differences in semantic representation or meaning representations, what can we learn from using these methods about the time course of meaning construction, but also the localization of meaning construction. And I think this is this is sort of an exciting new step where AI really comes in and allows us to answer these questions in a more fine-grained manner than we could before.
Yeah. So I have basically been also working on expanding the types of what I've been calling representations that we use to capture meaning, to indeed not only include language, but also to include other aspects of modality of our perception effectively. So there has actually been very recently quite a surge also in the world of GPTs and large language models, where there has been a focus on multimodal large language models that do not only process language but also process visual input and maybe combine those in the representations that they construct. And of course, that is really another step closer to how humans perceive language, because language is always grounded in the world. And what sort of in one direction of my work we are also looking at is to what extent can we actually identify how much there is a balance between this linguistic input and other perceptual input, and where does that fit in the representations that humans construct, right? So is that already at the level of word representations that we want to have this perceptual information, or only at the level of word representations? Or do we also want to capture that at a sort of a higher level of a situation understanding, where maybe visual or auditory input may also play a role in the types of associations that we make?
Okay. Well, you said that you had no idea what would happen in the coming 5 years, but that you expect that many things will happen. So maybe you should let me know when there's one big progress, and then we do a follow-up podcast. Anything more that you would like to add here?
No, that sounds great.
Sounds great.
Thank
and we'd
you.
like to thank you for the great questions.
Thank you.
Very nice conversation.
We leave it at that.